When we listen to the music of the 18th century in public now, say Mozart's 29th Symphony, which you'll hear during this film, we tend to do it in a concert hall like the Sage Gateshead. We'll sit in rows, the lights will go down, we'll be hushed, and we'll focus our attention on the stage. This is not, in fact, how they tended to listen to music in the 18th century. Music was much more a part of socializing. It could be in the background at an aristocratic party. It could be a talking point at an elegant salon where people would listen a bit, talk a bit, listen a bit, talk a bit. Or it could be listened to as if it were a kind of conversation itself. All of these approaches rested on the idea that music was an aid to or a form of human-to-human communication.
This is a question that I find very interesting, this idea of sociability and music. I think definitely if we look at it, we find relationships between themes, a primary theme and a counter theme. Do they sound the same? Do they sound different? Was the composer thinking about how those differences might be interpreted by the audience, perhaps? I think if you look at sonata form, it's very interesting to consider that it grew out of a structure where the first part of it is called the introduction and the second part is called the exposition. And if you think about how we communicate, we very often will say, "Hi, my name's Karin," and then that being the introduction, and then you move on to the body of conversation that you might have. And as that body of conversation continues, you might have an exchange between the person you're talking with. And in the sonata form, the third bit of structure is called the development. So you're taking the ideas that you're sharing and you're maybe changing them or considering different angles on them. And then you wind up kind of summarizing in the recapitulation, which is a kind of revisiting of the first theme and what that theme now means after having gone through the development. So I think this idea of music as dialogue, we certainly see elements of it. And I think it's a great way to think about music, especially as a listener, because it really gives you a framework to stick with a piece and to consider what is the composer trying to tell me as I'm in this live experience, which is what makes music different from so many other art forms, is that we have to hear it in real time.
Communication, conversation, and socializing were not new ideas in the 18th century, of course, but they did attain a particular importance then, partly because of the significance attached to furthering knowledge via rational discussion and public debate, and partly through the growth of particular kinds of socializing, such as the salon, a private space in which invited guests would meet to converse, or the coffee house, a public space where men would gather to read the newspapers or the latest pamphlet and discuss their contents. These institutions existed across Europe, including in Gateshead, home of the Royal Northern Symphonia, and Newcastle, the city across the river. And Newcastle still has its coffee house equivalent in the Literary and Philosophical Society, which is where we are now. A society formed in 1793 in order to promote the free conversations of associated friends, as they put it. The society, which moved to these premises in 1825, very quickly began amassing a library for its members, and in this library we can find a number of writings on conversation, which is another sign that it was an important topic. Alongside works by the Englishmen Jonathan Swift and Henry Fielding, I have here an essay from the famous Parisian salon hostess, Madame de Staël, in which she compares conversation in France and Germany. So this has been translated from the French in 1813. And then this one is my favorite. It's a two-volume treatise by Freiherr Adolf von der Knigge on a practical philosophy of social life, or the art of conversing with men. And this has some fantastic chapters on conversation with vain people, with irritable people, with obstinate people. That was translated from the German in 1799. Before there was the Lit and Fill, there were other places where people could socialise, and the concert was one of them. The composer and entrepreneur Charles Avison, a Geordie born and bred, established a concert series in Newcastle in the original assembly rooms on Westgate Road in 1735. Here, listening in silence would have been the exception rather than the norm. People could have talked, they could have walked, they could have sat in groups, they could have played cards. And when Avison advertised a later concert series he was putting on in the 1750s, he really emphasised this social element. So in the newspaper, he wrote that a concert keeps alive and improves the social and benevolent affections by the general intercourse of friends and acquaintances which it occasions. And intercourse here refers to non-physical interaction, of course. But music was not just muzak or a talking point. It was also itself seen as a form of communication. And this comes out most clearly in sources from the time that talk about chamber music, because the small number of players meant that each instrument could be seen as a voice in a conversation. Avison himself talks about music in this way in the preface to a set of sonatas for 2 violins, cello and harpsichord he published in 1760. So he says, this is music that is rather like a conversation among friends, where the few are of one mind and propose their mutual sentiments, only to give variety and enliven their select company. So here he describes the instruments stating their theme together, and then varying it and playing with it as if in a lively conversation with each other. And this gives us a way of listening to the music of this period, not just string trios or string quartets, but orchestral music. In the last movement of Mozart's 29th Symphony, for example, there is loads of dialogue between different sections of the orchestra. Extravagant flourishes that bring the conversation to a halt and then start it up again, and emphatic restatements of the initial theme. So you can hear the ebb and flow of conversation in it with only a very small leap of imagination.
Classical music is very conversational, and it's really full of dialogue because of the structures that we would expect to see, not just in the whole form of the entire symphony and its 4 movements, but also in how the first movement is shaped. Mozart, Haydn, incredibly clear examples. You'll hear a first theme and a second theme. You might have an introduction in that first movement. The classical symphony is built actually on this idea of very clear ideas that are shared here, then shared there, then the first theme comes back, very much like a conversation.